Hello, and thank you for joining our teaching for 21st century webinars brought to you by the David Horowitz Freedom Center and the Glazov Gang. I am your host, Annie Cyrus. Please use the Q&A box on your screen if you have any questions, and I will promise that we will get to them as soon as our very special guest presentation is over. With that being said, it is my honor and privilege to introduce our guest this evening, the one and only brilliant Daniel Greenfield. He is a Shellman Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center and the editor and writer at the blog The Point. Hi, Daniel.
Hi, thank you so much, Annie, for once again doing a fantastic job hosting.
Absolutely, my pleasure. I'm literally dying to hear your thoughts, Daniel. Go ahead, floor's yours.
It's been a while since I've been in kindergarten, but from what I recall, A is for apple, B is for banana, and there are a bunch of other letters. Then we get to I, and I is for insurrection, and I is for incitement. And these days we've got a lot of talk about insurrection and incitement. We've got this talk from the same party, the same people who for the last 4 years were inciting and insurrectioning all over the place. When the Black Lives Matter riots were tearing apart American cities, these same people were going, don't call them riots. That just sounds very bad. Call them an uprising. They're uprisings. What's another word for uprising? I think it's insurrection. So insurrection went from being a wonderfully great thing to being a very bad thing. But of course, these are the very same people who went ahead and tried to engage in a criminal prosecution investigation of Trump administration people for having contacts with foreign governments, and then spent the next 4 years telling foreign governments, ignore President Trump, we're going to get in, we're going to fix everything. And we're hearing a lot of talk about sedition now. Sedition, we haven't heard this much about sedition since the Adams administration. They're bringing back the Alien and Sedition Acts. That's how far they're reaching back. The very same people who have spent so much time lecturing us about the horrors of American history, the Alien and Sedition Act, the crackdowns in the 20th century on anarchists and then on communists, McCarthyism. There were Hollywood screenwriters who couldn't work for a whole 2 years. And now they're hunting down everybody who ever expressed any doubt about the election and trying to get them fired. And this is, of course, once again, coming from the very, very same people who spent the last 4 years insisting that the election was illegitimate because the Russians took out post-election ads on Facebook. And I'm not sure exactly how the two went together. They never explained how the two went together, but they spent 4 years claiming this. And of course, within the federal government, these people set up their resistance cells, one of which called itself Dumbledore's Army after Harry Potter. Though considering that J.K. Rowling is so politically incorrect now, they're probably going to have to rename it to something else. But they set up these resistance cells specifically to undermine President Trump. They leaked, they refused to implement policies. And toward the end, they were very blatant about this, but that was not insurrection or sedition or treason or any of this stuff. Now, I could spend the whole entire seminar pointing out the hypocrisy of Democrats and the left. And, there are people who make a good living of doing that. But the bottom line is they're actually not hypocritical. They are remarkably consistent. They're only hypocritical if we actually make the mistake that many conservatives do of measuring them by the laws of the United States, by the Constitution, by our own ideas of fair play. They've been actually pretty clear about what they believe. From the very beginning, they've made it clear why they oppose President Trump, and it's not the Constitution, it's not the rule of law, although they occasionally invoke those. It's because he is opposed to our values. Or as Obama liked to say, this is not who we are. And what does saying this is not who we are mean? Who are we actually? Well, we're not Americans, we're leftists. If you're not a leftist, you don't have the right to hold power. That's what all their calculations come down to. So when they say that when you oppose the election of a left-winger, that's sedition, it's treason, it's insurrection, it's incitement, it's a bunch of other stuff, what they're basically saying is only leftists have the right to hold power. Now, in the past, I've mentioned this repeatedly. Every single Republican president who won an election in this century, Democrats opposed the election. They challenged the election results. They challenged them in Congress. They challenged them, and second time Bush won, they challenged it in the Senate. They made a point of claiming that Bush and that Trump were illegitimate. And of course, this was not in any way insurrection, sedition, incitement, any of this stuff. This was perfectly fine because the bottom line is, from their calculus, it's not about the electoral system. It's not about what the constitutional codes are. It's about left-wing values. If you support left-wing values, then you have the right to hold power. If you don't, then you don't. And it's not just elections. This is what they do across the board. For example, when the Senate is held by Republicans, they decry it as the House of the Lords, as an illegitimate institution created by the Electoral College to protect slavery. And when the Democrats hold it, well, then the Senate is a respectable institution. The Senate is the reason that we have legitimate government. It's a hedge against populism. And they do this with everything. The House, the Senate, the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is a wonderful, important institution, except when Republicans take it, and then the Supreme Court is illegitimate and we must destroy it. Because the bottom line is they don't have any respect for any kind of American tradition or values. They're motivated purely by ideology, and their ideology tells them that any institution they hold is legitimate, any institution they don't hold is illegitimate. So the First Amendment, very important. We have to protect the First Amendment from President Trump being able to kick out our reporters when they assault members of his administration. Of course, when it comes to conservatives, we must suppress their speech because it's disinformation. And they do this with the right of assembly, with protest, with everything. Bottom line is they only believe only those rights, only those laws, only those institutions, only those positions that are held by them are legitimate, and the others are illegitimate. So when Democrats hold those positions, they will protect them ruthlessly. They will use all those things that they claim are civil rights violations. They're now preparing to roll out a war on domestic terrorism to protect against the so-called insurrection. And by the way, there was not an insurrection. The Civil War was an insurrection. If a bunch of people break into Congress and scream things, that's a protest. It might be a bad protest. It might even be a riot. But you know what? Democrats kept on doing this repeatedly, including during the Kavanaugh hearings. They would boast of storming Congress. This is the sort of thing they do. Now, Capitol Hill, for that matter, the Capitol Zone was not an insurrection either. It was a protest. It was a riot. It was violent. It was ugly. But they were not actually trying to credibly remove the United States government and replace it with another government. Claiming otherwise is, again, a lie, but we are dealing once again with the same people who have spent the last 4 years claiming that somehow the Russians elected President Trump without once ever being able to explain it. They go on, President Trump claimed that the election results were dubious without evidence, yet they never once provided a single shred of evidence for their whole Russian Facebook ads elected President Trump. But again, past tense. Bottom line is we're dealing with what we're dealing now. And the important framework in which to understand it is what I've just laid out, which is that any institution, any position that the Democrats hold, they now protect by claiming that anybody who is opposed to these institutions is, if you're questioning their control over science, then you hate science. If you question their control over the government, you're committing insurrection, sedition, and treason. And if you're questioning their control over the economy, well, you're just out to destroy the economy. That's just how they play this game. And of course, when they're on the outside, then they're the heroic resistance leaders who are fighting to reclaim our values. When they're in control, then of course, they're the ruthless, oppressive totalitarians. And this is the same game that they've played around the world for quite a while now. We've seen the same game play in Russia back in the day. We've seen it play in China. We've seen it play in Europe too many times to count. We've seen the same show before. They're just repeating the same show. And we've seen the show in America before, for that matter. If you recall, who killed Kennedy? It was the climate of right-wing hate in Dallas. Not a communist defector, it was a climate of right-wing hate in Dallas. And of course, they try to use that to once again, go ahead and suppress conservatives. During the Clinton administration, plenty of you remember all the stuff. Militias are the major threat. We've got to stop the militia threat. What did the militias actually do? Well, nothing. But the Clinton administration claimed that militias were a threat. They ignored al-Qaeda, they ignored Osama bin Laden, who of course went on to do absolutely nothing, and they spent all their time on militias. As a result, well, 3,000 people were killed on September 11th, and al-Qaeda managed to get a powerful worldwide network while the Clinton administration was busy chasing Rush Limbaugh and claiming that Rush Limbaugh and talk radio were the real terror threat to America. They're prepared to do the same thing, of course, once again on a much bigger scale, because they've been building institutional power. So history is repeating itself, but each time it repeats itself more viciously, more dangerously, because the Democrats have gained more power as a result. And they've also radicalized and moved further to the left. One of the biggest game changers that we're dealing with right now is not just how much power Democrats have in the government, it's two things. First of all, the media has moved so far leftward that it would not even think of challenging Democrat abuses. The ACU and a number of other left-wing organizations sent a letter opposing new domestic terror laws, saying the ones on the books are already sufficient. The media hardly reported it. If they'd sent the same letter to the Bush administration, the Trump administration, it would be front page news. The media is absolutely on board with this. they're not just on board with this, they are the professional propaganda core, they're the messaging operation for the Democrats, bottom line. The second thing is even bigger, and that's corporate buy-ins. This is what we've been seeing. The most obvious example is the big tech monopolies. It's Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Twitter, and so on and so forth, all coordinating. The tech industry buy-ins are huge, but there are also a number of other areas, and this is something that I explored in a previous pamphlet from the Freedom Center called Thought Control, Inc. What this basically lays out is that corporations, under the guise of so-called social responsibility, are increasingly pushing left-wing agendas. We've seen this very much during the Black Lives Matter riots. We've seen it before with major financial institutions coordinating to shut down firearms manufacturers. So this time around, we're seeing a lot of buy-in from the financial sector. We're seeing it from the big Fortune 500 companies. So it's not just the tech industry. The tech industry is in some ways leading the way, but it's not alone in this regard. So we're seeing this kind of oligarchy, the coordination between government and between the oligarchy, the financial institutions, the Silicon Valley monopolies, and beyond that, really the broader companies that are not even necessarily American, like Unilever, and companies that are these, but that are still huge multinationals like P&G, that are very much coordinating this kind of censorship. Obviously, the censorship has been one of the big developments. But it's going to go far beyond that. We've seen people obviously lose their jobs for merely stating their opinions, for participating in protests. Some people call this cancel culture, but cancel culture is too light a word for it. We're seeing very much something similar to the results in totalitarian countries, except it being crowdsourced through private institutions. So the government, in theory, very much in theory, can take away your First Amendment rights. So during the pandemic, we saw the government do exactly that. People were arrested for reopened protests. Meanwhile, not long after, when the Black Lives Matter rioters decided to protest, that was perfectly fine. But the government still has certain restrictions. So it's not going to directly come into Facebook and say, we want to take some of this stuff down. Though in practice they do, but they will make it somewhat indirect. They will do it in Senate hearings. They will outsource it. California now has an Office of Election Integrity, which is actually monitoring things and sending certain social media posts to Facebook and Twitter and saying we need this stuff taken down. But the bottom line is there's still a bit of separation, but private companies can do this stuff and they are very much doing it. So it's being outsourced to them. The result is we have something that looks very much like political repression in countries like Russia or China, but in theory it's members of the oligarchy doing this rather than the government itself. And this way they avoid some of the core challenges. They avoid Supreme Court challenges to repressing people's speech. And they're saying, well, no, private companies can do anything they want. Of course, they can do anything they want except, run conservative speech. But they can do everything they want when it comes to repressing conservatives. That's the one-way street. That's the one-way street that this is actually being played on. Now, the larger question is, how far is this going to go? And in a way that is very much up to us. It's very much up to us. We cannot seriously count on Republican legislators to do very much. Even if they were motivated to do something, bottom line is their powers are very limited. Republicans have lost their majority. There are Republicans, judges in courts. Those will potentially be important. But again, there's going to need to be a certain kind of momentum for them to take action. Ideally, judges, justices would just do the right thing. In practice, what we've seen this with the Supreme Court, we've seen this below, is that judges are very much like the rest of us. They follow the news just like we do. They're marinating in the same soup, which is one reason why Supreme Court justices, Republican justices, tend to go after. They spend enough time in DC. Their social circle consists of people who are more liberal, and they become more liberal. And that's a basic reality of living in some place like DC, New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, so on and so forth. It's harder to remain a conservative in these areas because your social circle consists of people who think very differently, who think leftward, and they shift you. You might not come out and say, put a Bernie Sanders bumper sticker on your car, but you change your mind on certain ideas. And as a result, if you want to understand where the Supreme Court rulings are coming from, I mean, people push the stuff that they're blackmailing the justices. I mean, they don't have to do any of this stuff. The bottom line is the people come in, they're in the part of a social network in which you have to be at least somewhat liberal. And so they want to be liked by these people. This is what you do. It's what happens to students who come into a school and they start changing. You come into a workplace, and if you don't have a strong will and a very strong personality, you start shifting, you start changing, you start adapting to this new perspective. Again, this is just something that is human psychology. It's something that happens. And this is something also that the media is counting on. This is why the media aims so much of its propaganda at the youngest generation, aims so much of it at social media, because it wants millennials to come in. It wants them to be influenced. It wants them to come through the schools and the colleges. It wants them to come through a social network and actually shift leftward. Even if they don't go woke all the way, it wants them to shift. So it's very important to create a climate that is pushing the right political understandings. And this is something where conservatives did very well in 2016. This was a big part of why President Trump won. It's something we were not really able to do properly in 2020. Censorship is part of the problem. The other problem is that we were just really unfocused. We were over the map. There was a very clear focus on what was important and what mattered back in 2016, 2020, between the pandemic and the riots and various distracting shiny objects, and even post-election, people were just all over the place. And really, probably the biggest thing that's going to have to happen this year in 2021 is the reunification of the conservative movement, is a growing focus on what actually matters, what it will take to push back. Now, it's going to be a long road because, as I mentioned, the domestic terrorism thing is being unrolled. We've got, at this point, about 10,000 troops still in DC. It was very important that governors, Republican governors, particularly DeSantis in Florida and Abbott in Texas, began pulling out the troops because the troops are there as props for this emergency. The Democrats want to maintain a state of permanent emergency for this great crisis of domestic terrorism. They're building a permanent wall around Congress. The same Congress that wouldn't build a wall around the border is happy to build a wall around Congress, which is absolutely disgusting because it's meant to be the people's house. But we'll save that one for later. They're going to keep troops there as long as they can. They want 5,000 troops through March. And 5,000 troops through March, it can be like Afghanistan. Then it becomes March of 2022 and 2024. And we've got an indefinite military presence in DC. And again, the really crucial part of this, beyond shutting down protests, is it creates this political theater. Because what the Democrats have done after the Capitol riot is declare that this is now the #1 priority. We have this great crisis. It's absolutely urgent that we take every possible step to fight this crisis. We can't talk about anything else except maybe global warming and the importance of wearing 3 masks on your face, except this urgent crisis, which requires that everybody band together and go after all these people for insurrection and sedition and incitement, the 2 I's and the 1 S. We're going after them. Now, these categories, by the way, are absolutely un-American. Accusing people of sedition is wildly un-American. The left kept claiming that you can't accuse people of sedition and treason just because they're members of the Communist Party. But of course, you can accuse them of sedition because they retweeted a meme about a stolen election. That is, of course, completely legitimate. Now, what the Democrats here did is what they've done before, which is they take a particular crisis, they take a particular explosive event, and they now try to tie every single conservative to it. And they have sometimes more success than others, but they never give up doing it. Thus, for example, the Gabby Gifford shooting, a Republican judge was killed, Gabby Gifford herself was wounded, and the Democrats and the media began insisting that it was incitement by Sarah Palin because Sarah Palin had a map targeting certain members of Congress, and Giffords was one of them. And this guy, who was, by the way, completely mentally ill, completely out of his mind, had no politics whatsoever, opened fire because he wanted her to be impressed by how well he spoke Spanish. I'm not kidding here. They began insisting that Palin was to blame for it, and the media, the New York Times and the Washington Post, has kept right on repeating this. And you know what? After the Capitol riot, they rolled out yet another op-ed by Gabby Giffords about her traumatic experience, trying to connect the two, because they absolutely never give up on their propaganda. That is something else for us to learn from. They absolutely never back down from their message. Sometimes they will briefly back off and retreat, but then they redouble it. They will come back with it. They will come back with it next year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now, until it becomes official history. For example, I mentioned the Kennedy assassination back in the day. You know what? They decided they were going to hammer it home with conspiracy theories to divert attention from the simple fact that a communist defector, a socialist, was the one who killed JFK. And they kept on doing this, and it took on a life of its own. They made movies about it. They wrote books about it. And the bottom line is, if you ask the population, including Republicans, about half of them will say, yeah, I mean, there was a conspiracy. And a bunch of them will even say it was the Cuban mob, it was the CIA. And this is all the stuff that by the way, Soviet Union came up with. Khrushchev actually came out and suggested this to the Washington Post, that it was a right-wing conspiracy. And this is now actually set and most people will repeat it back. And this is how law functions. It's why they win. They have this message discipline. We don't have message discipline. We jump on one thing for a few days, we jump onto another thing, and we forget the thing that we were talking about last week, and maybe sometimes we'll kind of briefly return to it, but that's about it. And to some degree, the culprit is social media. Social media goes back and forth, but to a big extent, the problem here is that we don't have message discipline because we are independent people, we're individualists, whereas they're collectivists, but it is going to be a challenge going forward. Anyway, back to the main topic. Their claim that this is incitement allows them to connect everything. Anything that anybody ever said questioning the election now becomes incitement to violence. And they've been pretty clear that they want to force out legislators who actually questioned the election. They suggested forcing out members of Congress using the 14th Amendment. They're now pushing to sanction and force out legislators, state legislators using local techniques to do the same thing. They're pushing, of course, companies to fire people, and they're pushing companies to stop donating to Republicans and conservatives. So they do have this massive program that they're unrolling, and their basis for this is incitement. Now, I'm actually pretty familiar with incitement from Israeli politics. Incitement really is a category in European law. It's not really a category very much in American law where you're supposed to be able to say anything you want, short of actually saying, I want to kill Mr. X. You're not allowed to say that. You're not supposed to say, I wish somebody would kill Mr. X. But short of that, you can say all sorts of things. The Democrat case for impeaching President Trump, for example, lies in him using the word fight in the speech. You know who uses the word fight in speeches? Absolutely every single politician ever. We're going to fight for amnesty for illegal aliens. We're going to fight to save the climate. We're going to fight against the polluters. We're going to fight against the racists. We're going to fight, fight, fight. And now, of course, saying fight is suddenly retroactively incitement to violence. So this is the same kind of nonsense that they do on a regular basis. And as mentioned, I have some experience with this from Israel because back in the day, some of you may be familiar with the Rabin assassination. An Israeli prime minister who decided to cut a deal with the PLO terrorists was assassinated. Immediately, they began claiming that this was incitement, by anybody on the right. Anybody who ever questioned the deal with the terrorists was now guilty of incitement, had personally helped pulled the trigger and killed Rabin. And all of them needed to be immediately shut down. They needed to apologize, they needed to confess their guilt, they needed to be arrested, needed to be sent to jail. And this went on for a bit of time. Then it came out. You'll never guess what came out. What came out was, of course, the assassin had himself been told to do this by a guy who was actually acting as an informant for the local secret police, who had set up a cell. Now, the big thing, back then Netanyahu was running for office. So he was still running for office back then. So what they did was two of these guys, the leader of them who was actually working as an informant, had a poster way in the back of the rally with Rabin in a Nazi uniform. And afterward, this photo was flashed everywhere. And so the bottom line is what came out was that the so-called cell that they tried to tie Netanyahu to, that they tried to tie the Israeli right to, was in fact basically a project of the local surveillance, the local version of the FBI. And, you know, we're seeing the same thing with the Capitol riot. We're seeing the head of the Proud Boys, who was actually a longtime federal informant. And this is something that people who actually deal with security issues know, because so many of the so-called white supremacist right-wing groups, their leaders are invariably government informants. This is so routine. This is actually a really key important issue why people should not do stupid things. Because if people urging you to do stupid things, you know what? People are breaking into the Capitol, don't go into the Capitol, because the people who want to do this are government informants. Even if they get arrested, they're going to get a slap on the wrist. The book is going to be thrown at you. It's not going to be thrown at them. The people who are making death threats, who are saying things like, let's kill this guy, they're government informants. We already know this, and it's going to come out more and more that the key people, the so-called leaders of the alt-right are government informants. And you know that because a whole bunch of these people were able to be on Twitter, they were able to be verified on Twitter and on social media, even long after President Trump was barred from it. So it's really important to use common sense in this regard. The people who are urging you to do stupid things, to do things that are destructive, to do things that will send somebody to jail, that will discredit the right, these people are almost invariably informants, or they're grifters who absolutely do not believe anything. But anyway, getting back to the main point, incitement is not an American concept. It is not an American idea to accuse people of inciting violence. There's no such thing as inciting violence unless you're actually telling somebody to commit violence. Telling somebody to fight is not incitement to violence. Likewise, the whole idea of insurrection, there was no insurrection here. There was a riot. You know what? We've had riots all summer, and those riots killed a whole lot more people, including an 8-year-old girl. They did a whole lot more damage than the Capitol riot did. And the same lefties that were absolutely fine and supportive and contributing to bail funds for those rioters are now suddenly very upset. They're now suddenly claiming that this was an attack on our center of government. The same people who actually were supportive of Black Lives Matter riots that tried to set fire to the Church of Presidents and set fire to the White House Gatehouse, guardhouse. They were completely fine with that. I'm not going to belabor the fact that they're hypocrites, but this is an important message that we need to take in. And we need to take in the bigger picture of this is a power struggle. It's a power struggle not over the Constitution, over these people suddenly wrapping themselves in the flag. Patriotism for these people certainly is the last refuge of the scoundrel. The only reason that they're suddenly patriots, much like Michelle Obama said she was proud for the first time to be an American, the only reason they're suddenly patriots, the only reason that they're suddenly talking about the Constitution and our republic and our democracy, the only reason they're doing any of that is because they're now in power and they're using that as an argument to suppress everybody who disagrees with them. During the Bush administration, they all had bumper stickers on their cars. Dissent is the highest form of patriotism. And they would attribute this claim, wrongly, by the way, to Thomas Jefferson, who was actually a quote from communist revisionist historian Howard Zinn. But you know what? Let's bring that quote back. The highest form of patriotism is dissent. Let's bring that quote back. Let's put that on bumper stickers. Let's put that one on t-shirts. Because the bottom line is now we are the insurgency. It is very important to understand that. We were, frankly, the insurgency under President Trump. We were the insurgency under Bush. We were the insurgency for quite some time. We were the insurgency really for most of the 20th century. But we haven't always felt like it. The more the boot comes down, the more we ought to feel like an insurgency. And there is strength in being an insurgency. Now, I'm going to distinguish between an insurgency and an insurrection. We are an insurgency because we don't control the commanding institutions of power. Forget about the government, forget about elected office. Even when we actually controlled elected offices, we really didn't control them. The so-called resistance, the so-called people inside the administration, inside the administrative state were the ones who were actually calling the shots. And we saw that, for example, with the census. President Trump gave an order about what to do with the census and how to distinguish illegal aliens from the actual legitimate Americans who were being counted in the census. And the Census Bureau first slow-walked it, they delayed it. And toward the end, they basically said, we're not doing this at all. And that is how the administrative state works. It means we don't really control the government. The people who are the permanent bureaucracy, they control the government. And when it comes to the economic institutions, the big companies, there was a time when a lot of these companies were conservative. Always they donated to conservatives because conservatives were opposed to regulation. Always they were opposed to certain kinds of regulation. So they donated money to conservatives. They still sometimes donate money to conservatives, but the people who are actually running these companies are very much on the left. And it's not just Silicon Valley again. We're talking much of the Fortune 500. We're talking Wall Street. We're talking the big multinationals are very much on the left. If you recall during the summer, this whole barrage of Black Lives Matter commercials from companies like Coke, from P&G Products, Vaseline running out this commercial that was absolutely ridiculous. All these companies for the most pettiest products do this stuff. It's not just Gillette's toxic masculinity. They've been doing this for a while. Coca-Cola put out their commercial before this a few years ago with the revised national anthem. Bottom line is all these big companies are woke. Woke might be broke. We like saying that on social media. Bottom line is these monopolies have gone woke because they want to merge with the government. They want to retain power and they want to retain monopolistic power. So all these companies are very much under the control of the left. As for the entertainment media, forget about it. It's gotten much worse than it was before. A point that I've made in the past is if you go back 20, 30 years, you could name a conservative entertainer, openly conservative entertainer, writer, under 40. Today, you basically can't do that. And by that, I mean somebody who was both public and somebody major, a movie star, best-selling writer. That is today, finding one of those people under 40 who is an open conservative is really hard. You have closet conservatives in Hollywood who are under 40, who are movie stars, but public people absolutely know they're going to get lynched. And they're going even after the people who are covert. They're going looking at their Twitter accounts and going, well, one of them is following Ben Shapiro. He's following that guy. He's following Ted Cruz. He must be a conservative. Let's get him. So, and that actually is cancel culture, by the way. People often misuse cancel culture. That actually is cancel culture. It's very Soviet. But what we are the insurgency. We're the people who don't actually have the power. What we do is we have moral righteousness on our side. We're actually the people who are the oppressed. We're actually the people who are the downtrodden. And what the left has been doing, they've been doing this with the Black Lives Matter riots, they've been doing this all along, is they are the elites, they are the oligarchy, and they make an alliance with members of the lower class, or which people claim to be lower class, people who are oppressed, and they claim to be fighting a revolution on their behalf. So we're fighting a revolution for Black people. We care so much about Black people that we want to talk about the oppression of Black people. Read about the oppression of Black people by the police from major corporations like Facebook and Google and Wall Street, because when you're oppressed, major companies, the biggest companies in the world, send out press releases touting your oppression. Or transgender, you've got Dr. Rachel Levine in Pennsylvania, who killed a whole bunch of people by sending infected patients into nursing homes. Of course, he removed his mother from the nursing home first, and now he's Biden's assistant health secretary. Now, this is a doctor, he's very well paid. He's an old white man, but he put on a blonde wig and a dress, and now he's oppressed. He's oppressed. You should feel sorry for him. You should confess your privilege because this guy put on a dress, and now he's a member of the vanguard of the oppressed peoples of the world, the oppressed blonde wig wearing peoples of the world. And this kind of shows the hollowness of how the left creates these oppressed groups on whose behalf it fights. But this is also routine. But the left is basically an alliance between the people at the top and the people in theory at the very bottom. This is what they've done all along. Their so-called revolutions come from the top. Fidel Castro, not a member of the oppressed. He had the president of the Cuba at his wedding back in the day. Che's parents owned a plantation. Lenin's family was a member of the nobility. These people are very much not the oppressed, or they're as oppressed as John Kerry, who's got a private jet and is fighting climate change from his private jet. The people who are at the top of the left are very much at the top. Obama's grandmother was a bank president. These people come from the elites. Kamala Harris, who was oppressed. She was forced to endure segregation deep in the South, in South Berkeley. Her parents, like Obama's father, again, wealthy foreigners, very much upper class. Kamala Harris grew up upper class, commuting around the world. These people are not remotely in the lower class, but they have to create this myth that they are the vanguard of the oppressed, and they do this. They trot out members of this victim group, and they say, we are fighting on behalf of these people. These people are oppressed. Give us unlimited power, allow us to suppress the enemies, the right-wingers, and we will create a utopian age that will be on the right side of history. And this is what they do in every one of their ugly, nasty, vicious, homicidal revolutions. They've done this in China, they've done this in Russia, they've done this in Cuba, they've done this in Venezuela. And of course, at the end of the day, what you have is a fixed, rigid upper class that might originally, some members of whom might have come from the vanguard of the peasants and workers brigades. But one of my favorite stories about the American left is this guy back in the early 20th century who would do rallies in New York City's Union Square, which is, by the way, in Manhattan. It's a very pricey area these days. And he would begin his addresses to the mob by saying, comrades, peasants and workers. There were not a whole lot of peasants in Manhattan, even in the 1920s or so. But they're completely fake. They're as fake as Bernie Sanders, who's got 3 homes and is, of course, always advocating against the 1%. They are the 1%. But what they do is they create this alliance between the top and the bottom against the middle class. They destroy the middle class. They squeeze the middle class dry. They eliminate it as an institution. And of course, they're doing this for the benefit of the oppressed. So what they do is they create propaganda about how oppressed people on the bottom are. Some of the oppression might even be real. A lot of it is fake. A lot of it is made up. All of it is justification for them to take absolute power and suppress. And once they actually gain power, they need an inciting incident, which is what we've seen, for example, with the Capitol riot. We've seen this with the Oklahoma City bombing. And these things can be actual incidents or they can be Reichstag fires. It doesn't really matter because the key point is how they exploit them. Never let a crisis go to waste, right? So they seize on this crisis. They then exploit it to engage in a major program of political repression, censorship, arresting and fining people, and entirely changing the culture. Now, to do that, they need to maintain the public's focus, and this is a big part of it. They need the public focused on the state of emergency. It's one reason they have all those troops. They have the fences, they have the barbed wire, they have the arrests going on. It's not just for repression's sake, it's also for the sake of the entire public propaganda. What they want is a permanent state of emergency, and what we have to do is deny them that permanent state of emergency. Really important thing that when Republican governors actually started pulling out the troops, this was a key moment. battle is far from won because, of course, they're still going to have plenty of troops there. And it's not just about the troops, it's about the state of emergency, which means, first of all, what all they want to talk about is the state of emergency. They want to talk about how threatened we are. They've given us the template themselves after September 11th for how to counter this by talking about civil rights abuses, by painting them as out of control fascists, as totalitarians who are exploiting an emergency. And where is this emergency? Okay, we've had the Capitol riot. What next? They're going to try to arrest a few people on increasingly spurious charges. They're going to break up supposed plots. But again, unlike Islamic terrorists, without a wave of actual violence, and this is why really it's very important that they not get that wave of violence. Without the wave of violence, increasingly their position becomes tenuous. They're maintaining this barrier state. They're maintaining Fortress DC. They're maintaining the state of emergency without an actual emergency. And this is where we step in. It's very important to carefully start exercising the right to protest, First Amendment rights. It's very important to do that in a way that agent provocateurs don't actually hijack into violence, because these people are going to be there. They're going to be waiting. They're going to be waiting for a number of reasons. Now, one of those is that Democrats very much want this to happen, which means they're going to give law enforcement quotas. What quotas means you have to bring in a certain amount of people from this and this faction. You have to bring in people who are planning attacks. And you know what? People in the FBI, particularly, they want to look good. Aside from their own politics, we could go to town on the politics of a lot of the people in the FBI. But bottom line is, local law enforcement, FBI, they want to look good. They want to hit certain metrics. The leadership is told to hit certain metrics, which means they're going to bring in plotters, extremists who fit a particular profile. And profiling is real. They're going to bring in people who fit a particular profile. They're going to find informants who are going to generate crises. These are people who are in many cases losers. They're people with criminal records. They're people who are good at talking, but not good at doing anything. They're people who are in legal trouble. They get busted for something. They're brought in and they're told, okay, join this organization, start organizing people, start finding people who are going to want to commit attacks, who are going to want to do dangerous things, who are going to want to clash with the authorities. Again, the more of this they get, the longer they're going to be able to keep this emergency going. It's a major priority for the conservative movement to shut this down. And it's a major priority for all of us not to be dragged into doing stupid things, to following people who are basically behaving destructively, because a bunch of these people are out and they're working for the other side, or they might just be working for law enforcement. But the bottom line is it comes down to the same thing. The Democrats have set an agenda of bringing in all sorts of people who are going to be engaged in extremism. If you play into their hands, well, they win. That's the bottom line as far as that goes. It's very important, of course, to continue pushing back on the various civil rights issues, on exposing the fact that these people are engaging in blatant abuses, that they're weaponizing terms like incitement in ways that are completely un-American, that they're claiming that anybody who asks questions about elections is really inciting to violence. Now, when it comes to ourselves talking about Democrat hypocrisy, doesn't really go very far, but it's an important message, but it should not be a message in and of itself. Just challenging their hypocrisy is not enough. It has to be hammered home that these people are not just hypocrites, that they are the rioters who are now declaring that we need a permanent state of emergency because the other side committed a riot. These are the people who are spent 4 years questioning an election, for that matter, spent the entire century thus far questioning every election that they didn't win, who are now claiming, who are now vocally insisting that questioning an election is treason, needs to be censored. These are the same people who keep talking about the dangers of censorship, the importance of the First Amendment, who are the biggest advocates for censorship. The media spent 4 years claiming that President Trump posed a threat to the free press, and all they've done is advocate for the censorship of a free press. They've claimed that there's disinformation, yet they can never actually define disinformation. This is really what we're up against. We are now truly on the outs. We're now truly the underdogs. We are now truly oppressed. We are now truly on the very bottom. There's only so much more power we could lose. We could lose power in state legislatures, and believe me, Democrats are working on that. Part of the program of actually expelling conservative legislators is about seizing more ground within legislatures. But the Democrats also know there's a ticking clock. Next election comes around. The election does not favor them. The election map does not favor them. I know some people think elections don't matter. They very much matter. Yes, the Democrats cheat. They've always cheated. They've always cheated. But their cheating has limits. Their cheating is limited to the extent of conservative turnout. The more Republicans turn out, the more conservatives, the more independents turn out, the worse it becomes for them. And independents are a key element here because it's not just Democrats and Republicans, right and left. I keep talking like that. You know, a lot of us fall into the fallacy of doing that, but most of the country are not Democrats or Republicans, and not even on the right or the left. Most people, and this is a big reason why President Trump won in 2016, most people are suspicious of the government. They're suspicious of the establishment. They're suspicious of whoever is in power. This is a big part of it. It is a huge part of it. Back in the day, I began going around the country and giving speeches, and I was very interested in former Obama voters who had actually come out and voted for President Trump. And the big reason why they did that is because anti-establishment. So right now, the Democrats have become the establishment. They've got a fortress in DC. They've got Biden up there. They've got Congress on their side. They've got the media broadcasting their propaganda nonstop. Independents are going to turn on them. Independents, in some cases, actually defected from President Trump because once he was in office, it's not exciting anymore. A lot of these people vote against whoever's in office. The Democrats are now in power in every sense of the word. It is important for us to be able to mobilize independents. That includes people who voted libertarian, and includes people who are just apolitical, by pointing to the basic reality. The economy at this point is rigged more and more to favor Democrats. That money from Wall Street, from Silicon Valley, has been going to elect Democrats. The Democrats have used their opportunity, used that money to rig the economy, to open the borders. Once again, they're opening the borders, they're opening up the visa programs to their own people. They're using it furthermore to engage in a campaign of political repression, to set troops in DC, to engage in comprehensive censorship. The Democrats are the establishment. We are the anti-establishment. They want to talk about insurrection. We can wage a political insurrection against them. We can show that they will assault peaceful protests. We can show that they will censor people who are simply stating their opinion. We can show that they're so desperate to shut down any discussion about the suspicious elements in the election that they're willing to go to any length to criminalize that kind of conversation. We can show that because we are actually the insurgency. We're actually the ones who are fighting to take back this country and to provide people with freedom and independence. That is the bottom line. That is the choice. That is always the choice against the left. We stand for freedom. We stand for individual independence. We stand for the government not actually monitoring what you say, not having troops outside your house, not investigating you because you said the wrong thing. We've talked about cancel culture before, but it's not just going to be in corporations. It's going to be pipelined through the government more than ever. We are dealing with a situation where we are going to see the evolution of a repressive state over the next 2, 4, or worst case scenario, 6, 8 years by the Democrats. It is our job, it is our mission to fight that repressive state, to expose its abuses, to challenge it, to challenge its hypocrisy, and to challenge its crimes. This is our mission. This is how we are going to take back the country. Thank you for listening. I look forward to hearing your comments and responding to your questions.
Well, thank you, Daniel. As scary as everything you said are, I'm glad you closed it up with, well, we're not going to give up and there's still a way out, or at least we try to save ourselves. But let me go ahead and start. I know some of the questions been sitting there for a while, so I'm going to start with the very first one I got. This is Mike asking, in the old days, the SDS talked about the need to exterminate 30 million conservative Americans to achieve their communist takeover. Many of those 60s revolutionaries are still active on the left. Do you think this is still one of the left's objectives?
I don't think they want to exterminate 30 million Americans. The population has grown quite a bit. They're probably thinking more in terms of 60 million. But they're certainly thinking in terms of eliminating the opposition, eliminating demographically, eliminating them physically. So one of the things they obviously do is open borders to simply change the demographics. But they're also perfectly happy to use other means. About a third of the people who died in the pandemic were in nursing homes. Democrat governors like Cuomo, like Murphy, like Wolf, mentioned him before during the talk, forced nursing homes to accept infected coronavirus patients. Some of this guidance came from the top down, including from the Centers for Medicare. Now, were these people calculatedly thinking about in terms of killing the elderly? Were they thinking we're going to kill 100,000 people? I don't think they were necessarily thinking in those terms. That's Nazi gulag terms. But the bottom line is they were thinking these people are expendable. And this is really what we might call a softer genocide. They're thinking these people are not the people whose lives we should prioritize. And we've seen this in real time with the vaccine, for example. The CDC and various state vaccine advisories began saying we need to put people of color first and we need to put essential workers first, and we delay giving the vaccine to senior citizens because they have privilege. You know, that's again a real world example of choosing who gets to live, who gets to die, and deciding, you know, the older conservative voters, those are the people we don't really think they should necessarily live. We don't necessarily think that we should prioritize those voters. We should maybe decide, well, dispose of those voters. You know, back in the day, we were talking about death panels with socialized medicine. Again, this is something that's going to be all too real. We've seen with socialized medicine, with the vaccines, how this works. They're going to say, well, you know what? Certain people of color, they're oppressed minorities, they should get the kidney ahead. They should actually get that surgery ahead of the person who needs a hip replacement surgery, who's an older person who's in their 70s and is a conservative. That's something that's very much going to happen. And, you know, it's one way to kill a whole bunch of people. It's not going to be death camps. It's not going to be, we're going to drop bombs on people. We're not going to have firing squads. Don't get me wrong. There are people on the left who would be willing to do this, right now. And, you know, when James O'Keefe would have some of the Project Veritas things, you would have people who are working for Democrat campaigns who would say things like this. But the bottom line is most Democrats are not at the place where they would think of doing this. Most lefties are not the place of doing this. You know, it's hard to actually knowingly kill large numbers of people. The Nazis had trouble doing it. They had trouble finding people who would go out and machine gun people and then put them in mass graves. Initially, this is why they turned to gas chambers, because initially they would actually go out and they would have soldiers machine gunning people and putting them into pits. And, you know, the soldiers might believe that they were doing the right thing, but they would still break down. It's hard to do. Having gas chambers was very much more efficient because you would bring in the people in the gas chamber. You don't see what happens in the gas chamber. Then you would have other prisoners take out the people from the gas chamber. And it was a very closed loop that would allow for genocide. This is the kind of thing we need to be thinking about. It's hard to actually kill people, but if you make it indirect, if you kill people in ways that aren't obvious, where the people who are the players in this aren't seeing this happen, it becomes much more viable.
Well, that's the scary but reality. Any comments about Douglas McKee, aka Ricky Vaughn, in Florida, the man who has been arrested and charged for spreading election disinformation for election memes he sent out on Twitter before the 2016 election?
You know, I mean, this is what I've said before. Don't be stupid. Don't do stupid things. Don't do things that are illegal. Because you know what? Of course, the law doesn't apply to Democrats. Democrats on the left can do whatever they want. They are going to use and abuse the law any way they can against you, which means don't be stupid. And if you're actually going to do something that pushes the law, then do it in a way that will actually make you look good, that will actually make you look like a victim, a martyr of free speech, rather than, again, doing something that is stupid, which is what this case is, frankly. Don't actually do things that will open you up to criminal prosecution while behaving obnoxiously. And frankly, this is a key point.
Agreed. AOC is now using the M word, mortar, and speaking about Ted Cruz. I have heard that she wants to primary Schumer in 2022. How likely do you think that is, and what her chances might be against him?
I think she's probably going to win if she actually does primary him. Bottom line is New York politics have become so radical and so extreme that Schumer would largely be relying on the upstate conservative vote to head her off. AOC is a celebrity. Schumer is more of an obscure figure. Schumer would not even necessarily have a caste advantage in that kind of election. So I think she could very well win. I think she's very much gearing up to do this. The squad is going to expand further. It's going to push higher up. It's going to push to take Senate seats, not just in New York. They're going to try doing this in California if they can. They're going to try doing this in a number of other states because really there's no hedge against them doing this. Mainstream Democrats don't believe in anything anymore. What does Schumer believe in? He believes in nothing. AOC does believe in things, or at least she pretends to believe in things. So leftists believe in things. So-called moderate Democrats believe in nothing. You know who wins in a fight between somebody who believes in something and somebody who believes in nothing?
Okay, here's a random question for you. I'm sorry to do this. What do you think are the chances of me running and winning in 2022?
Go for it.
No, I mean, I know, okay, I'm being serious because you said a squad. I'm a female, I'm Middle Eastern, I'm an immigrant, I have an accent, I'm brown. Aren't these what they look for? Do you think they're going to get behind me and support my campaign?
Yeah, they don't consider people minorities if they're conservatives. The moment you become a conservative, you're no longer a minority list. As Biden said, you ain't black if you vote for President Trump. 1 in 5 black men voted for President Trump. I guess they're not black anymore. And I forget who wrote this. I think it was on Huffington Post. Black men are the white people of black people. So, and there's now a claim that there's multicultural whiteness. So, whiteness is now a concept. You can be white and be black, and you can be black and be white. It's all very fungible.
Yeah, I don't think they want to make history with the first Iranian female congresswoman. Next question says, I am worried that HR1 will make the mass mail-in voting scam permanent across America. How can we ever win any election again after this?
So that is a very good question. That is one of the two huge threats as far as policy goes, as far as legislation goes. It would definitely be a nightmare if we actually are dealing with massive ballot harvesting and no excuse mail-in voting. A key question, and this is really a question that was in some ways crucial to the whole litigation over ballot fraud, which is, do states control their own election systems, or does the federal government? This is a federal power grab, which says that the federal government should control all state elections. This is an area where I think if the Democrats overreach, this is an area where the Supreme Court actually will slap them down, because constitutionally states do control their own elections. That said, if the Democrats do try to federalize elections, that is a two-way street, because it becomes possible at that point for it to go the other way, for example, to require universal voter ID. Because the bottom line is, while ballot fraud can be huge, it can be comprehensive, it's not absolutely total. Elections do shift back. And again, a point I've made repeatedly is that a huge chunk of the American people are a swing vote. And if Democrats abuse their power enough, they would have to perpetrate voter fraud on a whole other scale. And we're talking about something like Russia or Cuba to retain power, which is not to say that they will absolutely not do that, but I don't think they're prepared to roll out anything quite on that scale.
Agreed. And here's next question. Can you speak about the education system and how it can be liberated from the grip of the left?
I keep being asked this. I've been asked this for my entire career, and my answer is kind of two-part. The first part is, conservatives ask this question. They rarely go into education themselves, which is a basic problem. The left took over education by getting into it, building networks inside it, taking over the leadership, and creating a comprehensive left-wing educational system that we deal with now. Now, today, you can't just go into education. You obviously, if you're a conservative, you are going to be forced out. We've seen teachers who are conservatives forced out. We've seen this obviously with college campuses, but we've seen this also happening in middle school, high school, elementary school. A big asset to the left's takeover has been the centralized educational system, which means the biggest thing we can do is break up the centralized public school system that is socialized, that is tethered to local property taxes, has been an absolute disaster. First of all, it's created a two-tier living situation where the middle class is trapped and can't get into these good schools, or is paying insane amount of money to live in areas with these good schools. This is an argument that the left has made for health insurance. Health insurance should not be tethered to your workplace. You know what? Education should not be tethered to your local community. It should not be tethered to insane property taxes. It should not be tethered to a single system where the teachers, through their unions, can declare, we are not going back to work. You still have to pay us. You still have to pay us ruinous property taxes. We are not going back to work because we feel unsafe. So the answer is to break up the centralized education system, to have voucher programs. A number of conservative areas and states have already been experimenting with voucher programs. Let Catholic schools, Jewish schools, private schools jump into this. And you know what? Frankly, if there had been a really huge game changer to this administration, President Trump would have done what Obama did. Obama did, okay, we're going to implement Obamacare. It's illegal, it's against the law, but go ahead and try to take it away from people. What if President Trump had said, we're going to give educational vouchers to everybody. You can have your rulings, but go ahead, try to tell parents you can no longer send your children to Catholic school, and now that you have this voucher, it would have been unworkable. And frankly, the next Republican who gets into the White House, that's something you should just do. Create that as an entitlement. Create an entitlement for everybody to send their children to the school of their choice. Wreck the public school system, eliminate this entire embedded system of teachers' unions, eliminate this entire hyper-professionalization of teachers where you need a master's degree and 8 years of training about racial equity and how to teach social justice math to be able to teach in school. Break up that entire system, individualize it, keep it under the control of local school boards and local parents, give parents consumer choice. So if the school starts dividing up children by race and having them check their privilege, which is now happening in kindergarten, they can withdraw their students. Give parents the freedom to choose, and you actually have a more open, conservative educational system.
Okay, we only have time for one more question, so I'm going to kind of grab a couple of questions, put them in one. Biden's executive orders, why is nobody stopping it? Why is Supreme Court not jumping in?
So one answer, I'm just going to try to go through this quickly, is that conservatives are not really bringing litigation. You actually have to bring litigation to the Supreme Court for them to stop something. For example, people have asked, why is Justice Roberts not participating in impeachment, but the Supreme Court hasn't ruled on it? Nobody's brought it to the Supreme Court. And this is going to happen as the months go by. People are going to actually bring legislation in. I mean, litigation.
Daniel Greenfield, I can never get enough of you. So thank you so much for coming back. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. And thank you for giving us at least a little tiny bit of a hope that there's a way for us to fight back.
Thank you so much, Annie, for, again, fantastic job hosting. Thank you, everybody, for attending and for some really great questions. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of your questions, but you can always email me, sultanknish@yahoo.com, or you can just follow my articles and comment there at Front Page Mag's The Point.
Absolutely. And for those of you who have stayed with us, or if you're watching this later on YouTube, thank you so much for your support. Remember, these webinars are brought to you by the David Horowitz Freedom Center and the Glazov Gang for free. So if you'd like to support us, consider going to frontpagemag.com and make 100% tax deductible donation. With that being said, stay safe and goodbye.